So we were just talking about not only how did life start on Earth, but before then we were talking about when life started on Earth. Now we think that the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, and we think that it started by, this material being coalesced and squished, which made these protoplanetary disks, and the leftover material from trying to make the sun, the leftover stuff made the Earth. So the early Earth ended up being this molten, hot, rocky planet. It wasn't a very nice place for for life. So that's the first, I think, important thing to talk about here, is that this leftover material that made up the Earth, it was actually molten, it was hot, there were lots of impacts. Okay, so maybe we'll write that down. So it was hot, it was molten, so in other words, it was all sort of fire, and it had lots of impacts. What do I mean by impacts? I mean lots of these materials, these leftover planet bits, were basically hitting. So there were lots of these. In fact, so many that there's a period that we call the late heavy bombardment. Turns out a lot of this material, and a lot of these were comets, for example. So these rocky, icy bodies would just come slam into the Earth and make these huge craters and big explosions. So this was not a very nice place for life. And yet, this late heavy bombardment, that happened around, so we're actually going to call it LHB for short. That's the late heavy bombardment, happened around, some people say it's around 4.1 billion years ago. Some people said it happened all the way up until around 3.8 billion years ago, something like that. So it's hard to be exact here, but we can tell some of this stuff through geology. And in fact, the reason why we know about the late heavy bombardment, these craters are hard to find on Earth, especially the old ones. And that's because on Earth we have something very special. We have an atmosphere, which is a bunch of gases. And what that does, of course, we have weathering, we have water that can actually sort of erode things. So it makes these craters less and less look like craters, and things get filled in. So the Earth essentially sort of cleans its surface in some way. So that means that the craters that were left over from this late heavy bombardment, a lot of them have been hidden. So it's very difficult to know for sure about the late heavy bombardment by looking only at the Earth. But it turns out just before this time, we think that a large body actually slammed into the Earth and actually made some of that material fly out, and that coalesced into the moon. It turns out that if we look at the moon, we can count craters and look at these different impacts, because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, so these craters are still there. We can look at things like Mercury and other planets and other moons around other planets and see that. And all of them seem to show that there was this late heavy bombardment. So things really got slammed by meteorites and asteroids and these bits here. So all this big, really dangerous time to be around was around 4.1 billion years ago, all the way up to about 3.8 billion years ago. It's hard to tell exactly, but it seems to be around then. Okay, so up until around 3.8 billion years ago, things were just being slammed. It was pretty much all rocky and fire. And yet, the earliest life on Earth happened at around, so these are things called stromatolites. Those are some of the earliest geologic evidence that we have. So when we look at rocks, you can see, you can just look down and down deeper. With rocks, you see sort of different layers. So as you dig down deeper, you get older things, because material gets placed on top. So this is sort of newer. And if you look, this is older. And it turns out by looking at geologic evidence, so evidence in rocks, at some point of rocks that are roughly 3.5 billion years ago, you start seeing evidence of life. So this is the first time we seem to have seen life on Earth. And there's these things called stromatolites. It's basically just these, towers of sort of bacteria type stuff. And that stuff has been found in rocks around 3.5 billion years ago. But what I find really amazing is that up until around 3.8 billion years ago, things were all molten hot lava. And somehow this stuff right here needed to form. They think that there was some liquid on the Earth at that point. So that means the liquid had to have sort of formed somehow really soon after these big bombardments here. And actually we think that the liquid came from these comets. These things that were slamming in, they contained ice. So if you have billions and billions of these things hitting us, it turns out you get enough water to where you actually might make lakes and oceans. So that's sort of the thought of how we got the water. Because remember, before, everything was all fire and molten, so there's no water there. We think the water might have come from the comets. Well, it turns out then that only less than 500 million years later, so maybe we could say 300 million years ago, 300 million years later, all of a sudden life starts. We don't know exactly why, but we just know that it seems to have started. These are things called stromatolites. They're very simple life. It's not like they crawl around or anything like that. That was much, much later did things start moving around. But for then, it was just these weird sort of towers of bacteria type stuff. Now, it turns out these stromatolites that we see in rocks, for 3.5 billion years ago, turns out there's still places on the Earth where you can see stromatolites today. This is a picture of these live, real stromatolites now. Those are actually found in Australia, for example. But there's other places where you can find them. And lots of places you can dig in the rocks and see evidence of those a long time ago. So we think that was the earliest life on Earth. But what I thought, again, I just wanted to point out then, is that it's really, really interesting that, this life happened very, very shortly after the late heavy bombardment. So for whatever reason, the Earth became a very nice place to have life. Now, of course, once you had life, what happens? Then you have what we call evolution. Now, you might have heard of Darwin's theory of evolution, and there's a lot to it. And again, I'm trying to explain very, very big concepts and very deep things very quickly. But it's okay. We can get a good overview of evolution. So what happens is this. We are made of, a series of a bunch of elements, and those make up molecules, and those make up what we call cells. So if you have, your body is made up of a whole bunch of cells. That's really what makes up you. But remember, those cells, those are really made from these elements. Those combine together to make molecules. It turns out it's a little bit more complicated. There's also amino acids going on. But basically, you have these cells. And your body is made up of just billions and billions and billions of cells. You have skin cells, you have brain cells, you have bone cells, you have everything. And these different cells, these are these little sort of self-contained little sort of boxes, and they have information in them. There's like a little, let's say, an instruction manual on how to make another one of these, because your cells have to replicate. They have to make more. So how does your body make a new cell? Well, it has to use a little instruction manual, and that's what we call the DNA. So your DNA, this we think now it's a double helix shape. That's the stuff that's found in the center of your cells here. Well, not necessarily the center, but it's the important thing. It's the thing that basically contains the instruction manual for how to make a new version of this particular cell. These things have different links, and they're called adenine and thymine and guanine and cytosine, or ATGC. Turns out certain of them are allowed to bond with others and not all of them. But it turns out what happens when your body wants to make a new cell. It takes this sort of double helix shape, this sort of wound up sort of ribbon here, and it basically splits up the ribbon, and when it does that, it has to make a copy of itself. So it's really kind of cool. So it makes basically a copy. Essentially, it's like trying to use a copy machine to make a copy, or to copy and paste something on your computer. But there's a problem. Sometimes when you make a copy, there's a mistake. So a mutation is just when a mistake happens in your copying. So a mistake happens. It can be a random mistake. Maybe one of these A's is switched with a T, or maybe, I don't know, there's a C and a G instead. So there's a mistake. An error is made in the copy. What happens with those mistakes? Now, those are called mutations. And a mutation can be good. It can be bad. It can be neither. Maybe a mutation makes you have, I don't know, it makes you really stupid. So it makes the next cell really bad at doing something. Well, then maybe that cell won't live because it'll die because it's bad at doing something. As a result, those ones will die, and we would call this survival of the fittest. Because what if you had a mutation in you, in some of your cells, that gave you, I don't know, better night vision, so you could see better in the dark? Well, if that allowed you to live longer, to not be eaten by other animals, let's say, well, then that might make you have an advantage. And if you have an advantage, maybe you live longer. So the other people, the other animals that don't have that same mutation, maybe they die. So over a long period of time, over many, many generations, this is the explanation for evolution, that it's survival of the fittest, that organisms adapt over time. And actually, this has been seen. I mean, one of the famous example is these different finches, or these different birds in the Galapagos Islands. You can go to different of the islands where the animals seem to have evolved separately from each other, and they have like different beak sizes and all these different things that are well suited to their environment. Which means, if you left one of these birds long enough on a particular island, maybe they develop a beak that's a certain shape to help with whatever's grown on the island. And yet this, a similar bird on a different island would develop differently. My wife and I have actually been to Galapagos Islands, and there you see some of the sea turtles, or even the land turtles, sorry. Those turtles have actually, they're called tortoises, I think. But those ones, some of the ones there had leaves that are very high up, so they've developed a shell that can allow them to lift their neck up. But other islands, those ones had where the leaves were low, so the turtles don't have that same thing. So it's kind of cool with evolution. And we think that ever so slowly over time, sometimes different species sort of split off. That doesn't mean that the other one disappears. It means it still keeps going, but sometimes you make a new species. So maybe, I don't know, it develops wings and it starts to fly, and these ones maybe become, I don't know, whatever else. So these mutations, or survival of the fittest, that could be an explanation for how we eventually got here. I mean, we talk about how we think we evolved from apes, and then those apes became more and more evolved until us. I know some people say, yeah, but then what happened? Why are there still apes? Well, that's because some of them evolved to become us, but some of them evolved to become, well, other apes. So they don't always have to make, us, for example. They can make other things. That's why I like this little t-shirt. Instead of Viva la Revolution, it's Viva la Evolution. Ha ha ha. So if we look at this one right here, this long chain of events of evolution eventually leads to us. That leads to us sort of sitting here talking to each other, or at least listening. So after that, there was a long chain of evolution, and there's lots of natural events that affected this. At some point, so right here we can see that this is the amount of years. So this is a long time ago, 4.5 billion years ago, because those are thousands of millions. So just see this decimal right here, this is 4.5 billion years ago. This is 4 billion years ago, and 3.5 billion years ago, and so on. This is 500 million years ago. So over time, when the Earth seems to have formed around 4.5 billion years ago, that's when it was formed. Of course, it wasn't just one day, right? It took a while to form. Then we had this late heavy bombardment, this meteorite stuff, and very shortly thereafter, life came. And life started, and all these neat things happened, like photosynthesis and oxygen, and then you had more and more complicated cells and more complicated life with multicellular life, complex. We had animals start, we had land plants, even dinosaurs and mammals, flowers, and then, of course, modern-looking humans eventually now. What's interesting, though, is that there were a number of things that happened on Earth that maybe if they hadn't happened, maybe we wouldn't end up here today. One thing that happened is we call it snowball Earth. There's strong evidence to show that the entire Earth was completely covered in snow, and that actually killed off a lot of the life on Earth. Now, the stuff that survived, of course, then flourished afterwards, once it warmed up. There's another feature that, for a while there were dinosaurs, reptiles or lizards. They were the kings of the Earth at the time. Who knows if the dinosaurs hadn't died out, maybe mammals like us wouldn't have been able to take over. So maybe we have to thank the fact that the dinosaurs seem to have been wiped out at a very short period of time. Again, we can use geology and look at rocks, and it turns out that we see, when we dig a certain, depth for rocks again, we see, dinosaurs here, and all of a sudden, and there's lots and lots of them. The deeper you go, there's lots of dinosaurs, let's say. I can't seem to spell today, huh? Dinosaurs. But all of a sudden, there comes this very important time right here. So all of a sudden, past this certain point, no dinosaurs. So no more. So this is what led scientists to believe that the dinosaurs were wiped out. Somehow, it's a very, very sharp boundary. In fact, they call it the KT boundary. And there's strong evidence to show that during that time, they found some evidence in the rocks to show that something that is not naturally occurring on Earth, something not from Earth, happened then. And it's explained now. We think we know the answer now. We think that there was a gigantic meteorite that hit the Earth. And we call this the KT boundary because if you look in the rocks, before then there were dinosaurs. After that, no dinosaurs. And you see some strong evidence of meteorite type stuff. You see some elements that aren't really found on the surface of the Earth. And yet at this particular time, there's lots of them. Those elements are found in meteorites. So we think that a big giant meteorite knocked out and sort of killed all the dinosaurs. And they never really came back. Not exactly true. There's crocodiles and other things that are sort of dinosaur-like, but at the time, they were the kings of the earth. They were everywhere, and there were tiny little mammals around that were probably cowering and getting eaten by these big reptiles. And yet afterwards, then, mammals took over, and those mammals became things like us. So maybe we have to thank the fact that this giant thing actually wiped out the dinosaurs. Maybe that's what made us possible. So that's a very interesting question, I think, to ask is, would we still be here if, all these things hadn't happened? So in other words, are we just evolutionary accidents? Or if you're some sort of god and you could rewind the clock, back to when life started and press play again, would we end up here at the end? Or maybe the dinosaurs weren't killed, so maybe there's like really clever reptiles and dinosaurs. Who knows? Or who says that they have to be clever? Maybe they've just evolved into different things. I think they're really interesting questions to ask.